Gucci, or if I like, as I like to call it, Gucky. This is a video that I keep thinking I should do, and then I go to do it and I get distracted. So this is one that has kind of been in the works for a little while. Blush, specifically on our brown girls. I feel like sometimes blush is one of those things that it's hard to tell if it's going to work on you or work for you. And that's something that I really struggled with blush at first, because it was hard for me to decide if I thought it would actually work for me or if it wasn't going to show up, or like things like that. So I want to give you some tips and tricks. Now, I love pretty much all blush, and so I'm not necessarily going to get into the texture of blush that you are applying. So cream, powder, or a liquid, I like them all. There are benefits to all of them, and that's going to depend a lot on your personal preference and skin type. I tend to do some sort of liquid or cream and then a powder over the top, just because I find that that is honestly going to give you the longest lasting blush formula. However, that's really going to be very dependent person by person, what you decide to do with your blush or how you decide to apply it. Let's talk a little bit about color. I feel like color and finish are both really important when it comes to blush in general. So I'm not wearing blush. Let me show you. Okay, so this is the Burt's Bees blush. I think that like this is a really pretty color, but I don't know if you can tell, the color saturation just really isn't there. So if I were to try to apply this on my skin, I might get a light flush, but do you see how that comes off as really ashy on me? Because honestly, I need something that's going to be just a touch darker than that. Like, even when it shows up, it doesn't show up as a flush. It kind of shows up as like a weird ashy highlight. It's because the pigmentation isn't there in this blush. Now, it's a pretty color, and if someone lighter than me were to use this, they might really like it. But for me, like, that's nothing. So the first thing to do is make sure that the pigmentation is there on that blush. If you're darker than me, you're going to look for a slightly darker pigmentation. If you're lighter than me, like I said, this could be really pretty. Now, a good example of a pink blush that has the pigmentation is this one. Just right off the bat, like you can tell, this one is slightly deeper. This one also kind of leans a little bit purple, which we'll talk about purple leaning blushes in a minute, but the pigmentation automatically is a lot darker. If I were to tap this on my cheeks, I start to actually get a real flush. Now, I'm a lot tanner than I was when I bought this, but even that is a little bit light on me, because honestly, a pink blush, especially if you're a deeper skin tone, isn't going to really show very nicely, or it's not really going to translate to a flush, I should really say, versus something like this. Now we're kind of getting steadily darker, right? So I showed you in comparison to the Burt's Bees. This one is even slightly darker than that, richer in pigment. This one is really where I'm going to start getting a true blushy flush. And I've used the same brush for all of this. But do you see how all of a sudden it's looking less like a highlight, more like a true flush? Because the pigmentation of this one is more similar to my skin tone. I'm gonna see if I can get this to turn a black and white on the screen, or maybe I'll show a picture. But the difference in these, like tonal level wise, this one is more close to my actual skin tone than this one is. So tonal, like level wise, like darkness wise, we want our blush to be on par with our skin tone. Otherwise, it's not really going to show up very well. And I'll try to make that photo black and white, but basically we want our skin tone to be the same level of darkness as our blush. Our blush can be slightly darker, but at least the same level of darkness. I'm gonna swatch a few more blushes on my cheeks. So I mentioned purple blush. The thing is, and people have talked about this a lot, so I'm not gonna go too in depth on this. The thing is if you want a really pretty pink flush, you're gonna have to use a purple blush. And this has to do with underlying pigments. Basically, the purple neutralizes the yellow in our skin tone and turns it a pink color. We're just gonna do a little swatch on here. Do you see how all of a sudden, like that? I mean, this is a purple blush, but honestly, when it's blended out, that's a really pretty color. Tonal wise, it's about the same, if not a little bit darker than my skin. That swatch isn't a very good swatch. I really need to get in there a little bit more. But like that blush is really going to translate as a hot pink on me. Now, there's a lot of blushes that it can be hard to tell. So for example, if you're looking at this Pixi blush, this is lighter than me, but it's so corally that it could still end up working. depending on your skin tone. Now, this one looks decent on me, I've been telling you that from experience, but it's not going to look good on someone that's slightly deeper than me. It's just not going to work very well. LYS is a champ for making great products. Now this is more of a mauve color because it leans kind of purpley. It does translate as to really pink on the cheeks. And if I swatch that on my skin, you can see like, okay, it's mauve, but if I were to blend out a section of that color, I start to get a really pretty flush of like corally pink on my cheeks. Especially if you're deeper than me, you might really, really like a berry color. Milani makes this one like berry smooch is what it's called. But even by the cap, you can see like, this is very much if you were to have squished some blackberries or something. Like that's a really pretty color, but honestly, on me, unless I'm very, very light-handed, this one starts to look a little bit crazy on me. And I honestly think that that's the case with most blushes, is you start to get a little out of control really quickly if you don't know, first off, your undertones and don't have an accurate representation of how light or dark you are. This Tarte Sea Breezy blush is a great example of this. Honestly, I could see this working decently for a very fair skin tone, but this actually works really nicely for my skin tone too. When I really get in there, it's very soft, but it's a little bit mauve-y, and then when this one gets blended out, it doesn't look too crazy. I always try to like end up doing these like Barbie pink colors, but really what happens when I swatch this is they never show up how I want on my cheeks. So this Makeup by Mario one is fairly pigmented, but not all of them are like this. A lot of them end up being like too much or too little, and you almost need one that leans a little bit more purple or a little bit fairer. This one on my skin is actually pretty good, but on a lot of fairer people, this one's just not going to work. I also felt that way about, so I heard so many good things about the NARS Orgasm blush, and I kept thinking, well, it does look pretty. Remember I talked about it needs to be the same depth of color as you? That is way light. And I kept thinking, well, it works so good for a lot of people, but that barely shows up on me. Now, when compared to the, they make a slightly darker version, this one works okay on me. This one's still not great. Do you see that? It's okay, it's not great. If I really, really want a pink, something like this is going to work a lot better. So I mentioned these two, neither of them really worked that great for me. Well, Haus Labs is more like the Makeup by Mario one, where it's got a lot more pigment to it. The depth of color is really there. All right, let's do a couple more swatches. This is one of my favorite powder blushes of all time, the Trios by ABH. But when I swatch this one, like this one works pretty good. This one works pretty good. But this one, honestly, hopefully you can guess, this one isn't necessarily going to be the best color on me. Now, that's mostly because it's just not dark enough. Honestly, looking at all these blushes, I do have a lot of really good options, but as you can see, like these two on the bottom, this one right up here, Burt's Bees one, there are also a lot that really just are never going to work for me. And so it's really important to kind of look at that depth of color. I would say that's like one of the biggest things. I know when the Dior Rosy Glow one came out, or like everybody was talking about like this one, and I was thinking, okay, well, that's a very hot pink. That one actually, if you can build it up enough, ain't too bad. But you wouldn't know it looking at a pan. So sometimes it is a little bit trial and error, but honestly, most of the time you're just gonna have to look at the colors and say like, is this going to be deep enough for me? Is it going to show up on my skin? And is it going to show up in more of like this vibrant way? Because if it's not going to show up at least like this, it's not really going to show up nicely as a flush. Because think about it like this. When you blush, which essentially a blush is what your blush products are trying to mimic. When you blush, your face gets hot, your cheeks turn a reddish color. So obviously a pinky reddish blush are the ones that tend to look the most natural. Well, let me tell you what, your blush is always darker than your natural skin tone. Or from what I've seen, your blush is always going to be darker than your natural skin tone. So something like that, or those two NARS ones that I pointed out, or even that ABH one, that's not darker than my natural skin tone. That's gonna do almost nothing. I'm sorry, but it just isn't. It's gonna do almost nothing to actually, you know, mimic what a blush looks like. So that's a lot of information. I'm gonna wipe off some of these swatches from my face, and then we're gonna talk about some brands that do an excellent job of creating deeper versions of blush. Okay, so all of that random blush has been washed off my face. Unfortunately, this is just facts of life. The blush formulas that tend to be best for deepest skin tones, most of the time you can't really find a lot in the drugstore. And the same with luxury beauty. Like, just facts of life, it tends to be more of the higher end formulas that make blushes that work. Now, that's not to say that you won't find the on and on blush that will work for your skin. But let me tell you what, let me just put it like this. This, I believe, is the darkest shade of the Pure Essence, or the Pure Nude Baked Blush. I believe it's the darkest shade, and this barely works for me. The same thing with this Milani Baked Highlighter, or Baked Blush. Pretty sure that this is the deepest shade. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some. There are some that work for deeper skin tones. The problem is it's just few and far between. The most blushes you're going to find that work for brown skin tones are going to be in the high-end category. Now, that being said, I'm going to talk about a few blushes that I've found that are beautiful and would work beautifully for deep skin tones in the cheaper categories. So I mentioned that I always like to layer my blush, so excuse me while this gets a little bit crazy. But the Milani makes this berry smooch color. This is one that I swatched in that previous section. This one is a liquid blush. On me, it can get a little bit crazy really fast, but it is beautiful. Like, you can't tell me that's not a beautiful color. Now, if you're slightly darker than me, this probably would be slightly better, because this one is a little bit pigmented and kind of shows up that way. But this is a beautiful color. Infallible, L'Oreal Infallible Fresh Wear Blush is also very much in the same category as, like, look at the depth of that. Now, let me grab another brush and so that I can apply over the top of this. We're just gonna do a little bit, but check out how beautiful that blush is. Now, this one is more of like a brownie blush. Still, oh, I'm very blushy right now. But those are both beautiful colors, and these are in the drugstore category. I have two more honorable mentions in the drugstore category that I think are just beautiful blushes. I'm gonna go ahead and clean off the brushes that I used so that I'm not dirtying like 5,000 brushes. So I just cleaned off my brushes with this Sephora Daily Brush Cleaner. There are two more, I feel like, well, I actually have a third blush that I really like from the drugstore, but we're just gonna do these two for easy's sake. NYX does this Sweet Cheek Soft Cheek Blush. They do this in a liquid format. So this one I think is also decent. I believe they have a few more colors than this if this isn't quite deep enough for you. But honestly, I think that this is a beautiful option. Like, first, that's pretty, right? Soft, but pretty. The other one, and this is another drugstore option, this is what I'm going to layer on top of it, is this Kokie Professional Blush. They have a lot of different colors. This just happens to be the color that I have. But this one is so pretty. Oop. And don't be like me and concentrate it all in one place. Also, like, a beautiful option. So I mean, Milani, or the Kokie, Milani, the L'Oreal Infallible blushes, these NYX Sweet Cheek blushes, these are all beautiful options for my brown skin girlies. Alright, so an honorable mention, I just have to mention it because they do really beautiful blushes, and they tend to make deep-ish blushes, not like super deep, but deep enough that they're beautiful options. ColourPop makes a putty blush as well as the stick blushes. These stick blushes are one of my favorites from the drugstore. But these are beautiful options. So ColourPop is also a great choice if you're interested. I'm going to clean this off and then we'll move on to a couple of higher end blushes. Higher end blushes. One of my very, very, very favorite, not necessarily formulas, but they always make my favorite colors of blushes, is Tower 28. So I have this orange one, and honestly, I love this blush. Love this blush. I'm actually going to do the purple one because purple is more trending right now, but they also make this gorgeous purple blush. Now, I always do a cream and then I top it with powder. This one is so pretty. And it is really like a great option for my brown skin people out there. Like, look at how pretty that is. I look like I have glass skin after putting that on. So like formula wise, if you're not wanting glass skin, stay away from this. But like that blush color, I never can get quite enough of this type of a blush formula. I think it's so pretty. I would be remiss if I didn't mention another blush formula that always does a great job about formulating for darker people. Haus Labs, sorry it's dirty. Haus Labs always does a great job formulating for darker skinned people. So this one is like, this color is so rich and is like a great companion to a lot of other blushes. Like, look at how deep and rich that is. This one I find even on myself, it's quite easy to go overboard on. Because like, look at how pigmented that is. Such a pretty blush. I love this blush. I actually love it enough that I've picked up a second one of it because she just did such a phenomenal job on this blush. So Haus Labs does a great job. So does Tower 28. Now, I know I need to pick up more colors of this, but LYS is known for their beautiful formulations for deeper skin. Great choice for blush, pretty much always. Like, first of all, that pigmentation is still there. Like, it's hard to miss with the LYS blush. I think it's so pretty. Like, the LYS bronzer, it's hard to miss on because it is so pretty. And it's specifically formulated for those with deeper skin. So even if you're a lot darker than me, they honestly have a lot of great options. And it's a cream too, which is, I think, great. Forgive me for not having this in better packaging. Makeup Forever, though, also has great options. This one is a beautiful formula, and honestly, it's Makeup Forever. Like, it's hard to go wrong. So we're going to put this one over the top of the LYS. Like, it's just pretty. And they have a really great for, like, deeper skin tones as well. So just a quick recap. We have Makeup Forever, LYS on this side, Tower 28, and Haus Labs on this side. Beautiful, both of them. Both of them are beautiful. Okay, so I mentioned that higher end blushes just have overall more, right? So I'm gonna go over a few more on my face, and then I'll give you some shout outs. First, this Fenty blush. This is a very pink blush. It still actually works. I didn't think it would, and then I tried it and I was very, very impressed. But it just creates that nice soft flush on the cheeks. I ended up really, really liking this one. I think this is the first ever cream blush that I tried, and I'm so glad I did because it turned out, it's beautiful. I'm so sorry, I don't know what's going on with my voice. Apparently I'm losing it. Now, say what you will about Tarte, but they do create stunning blushes, and these blushes are the longest wearing blushes ever. So this one is a little bit lighter in color, but I think that there are still like beautiful shades within Tarte that like work very well. I honestly picked up the smaller version because I wasn't sure about it, and I fell in love. And honestly, part of the reason I fell in love is because it works well, no matter if you have deeper skin, if you have lighter skin, or brown skin like myself. This one is kind of a cheat, but I know that if I don't mention it, someone's gonna be like, what about this one? So Patrick Ta also makes some great blushes for brown skin. Now, he suggests that you actually do the powder first and then the cream on top. Ugh, it hurts my soul a little bit to do it that way, but that's what we're gonna do. Again, this is kind of a cheat because this is a powder and another one all in one, but like seriously, look at that flush. You can't tell me that that's not beautiful. Now, Patrick Ta is one that had to grow on me a little bit because I wasn't sure about, I didn't like him at first. I didn't like his blush at first, but they are very pretty. And then the cream, like look at that glow that it gives. I'm gonna use my finger a little bit. Like that's some serious blush. That's one thing about Patrick Ta. I know that people don't always say that, but I always find that it goes on a little bit patchy, and then I have to do a little bit of doctoring. If you don't have that problem, tell me what you're doing, because I always find that to be the case. It is very pretty, but I always find that I get some of that patching with his formula. So maybe it's what I use underneath it. I'd love to know what you guys think. But Patrick Ta, Tarte. Okay, some honorable mentions because like I said before, there are tons within the high-end makeup community. So this was the this was the limited edition holiday launch, but honestly, like this color, this color, this color, maybe even this color, depending on how brown you are, they're all going to be gorgeous colors. Like, and this is a NARS palette, the NARS blush palette. Honestly, NARS complexion products are beautiful. I mentioned that the NARS Orgasm blush has never worked, but that doesn't mean that not all NARS products don't work. Like this is a beautiful palette, and NARS makes beautiful blushes. The Anastasia Beverly Hills, like these ones are so pretty. They also make a deeper version of these guys. I think they might be slightly pinker, but they're also beautiful. I also want to give out a few shout outs to some higher end brands. It took them long enough, but Dior finally has a couple that work really well for deep skin. This is the one that I have, and I actually really like it. Pat McGrath has some beautiful blushes for deeper skin tones. Gucci, or as I like to call it, Gucci, also makes some really pretty blushes for a deeper skin tone. So it's not like there's not blushes out there. We just have to be slightly more choosy than people. Honestly, for us, it's more about the depth of the color. The depth of the color needs to be there. We need to be able to look at it and say like, okay, that's a deep color. Let me give you an example. In fact, I can give you a few examples. When I was swatching colors, I mentioned the original Dior Backstage blush, right? Versus the Makeup by Mario one. You can tell that this one, compared to this one, is a lot richer in pigment. That's what we need. Our brown skin girlies need that richness of pigment. Like this one, it just isn't going to cut it like this one will. I have another example. So I have two of these blushes here. They're from e.l.f. They're the e.l.f. Putty blushes. I mean, you can tell which one I use more often, but which one do you think has the more depth of color? It's this one. Now this one is more corally than it is pink, but this one, the depth of color isn't there. Even when I swatched it looks ashy, versus this one doesn't look ashy on me. So the depth of color. There are so many blushes to choose from, but really the trick is making sure you're choosing color that has that depth to it, because that's what your skin has. As far as like color theory, let me explain it in this way. So color theory is kind of essential when it comes to doing makeup, right? And one thing that I like to say to my students, my hair students, is that yellow adds brightness to any color, red adds depth to any color, and blue adds deepness to any color, right? So that's what the primary colors do in terms of things. Well, if you think about brown, brown is used by mixing all three of the primary colors. I'm brown. I just mentioned those putty blushes. I mean, in reality, which one do you think has more red in it? This one or this one? Because I would venture to say that this one probably has more red. And maybe it really is that difference of which one is going to bring some of that depth back in. Because, I mean, in the example of the Dior blush versus the Makeup by Mario blush, which one has more red in it? I mean, like this one very obviously has more red, but this one is also more white. It's way more desaturated. So what's really going to bring back more depth? Well, we're looking for a saturated pigment. We're not looking for something that's desaturated because it's not going to show up on our skin. We want something that's very saturated in pigment and something that's got a little bit more red in it because it needs that. Even in terms of purple blush, some of the purple blushes I brought up, I mean, how do you make purple? Purple is made with blue and red. That's more red than blue. 100%, that's more red than blue. So we are looking for something that's got a decent amount of red in it, because otherwise it's really not going to show up on our skin. Now, if you're darker than me, you may be looking for something that's got a tiny bit more blue in it to bring back that depth. But for me, I'm looking for something with some more red in it. Those that are fairer than me are probably going to be looking for something that is more desaturated, has more of that white and pink pigments in it. So if you're ever having a hard time picking out a blush, make sure you keep that in mind. Like, hey, I want some red in my formula, and I know that I'm probably gonna want to make sure that there's not a whole lot of white in there. Hopefully this helps you. If you like my content, I make videos about hair, makeup, and skin. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment. I'll see you later. Bye!